Hi everyone, welcome to Pioneers of Feminist Porn. This event is brought to you by Shush.com, the web's premier porn site for women and couples. I'm Dr. Chantal Tibbles, and we are here live on MindBROWSE.com. Let's get started. You can't talk about the development of feminist porn and not talk about Candida Royalle. Candida has been producing erotica since 1984, when the prevailing attitude in the adult industry was that there was no such thing as a market for porn for women. 30 years later, Candida's films are still serving as a standard to which her peers in women's erotica aspire. Today we have the distinct honor of welcoming Candida Royalle to MindBROWSE to talk about her history, the state of the adult industry, wider culture, and erotica today, as well as her plans for the future. We're also joined by New Sensations director Jacky St, who's considered one of the leading directors in porn today. Throughout this event, if you have questions or would like to comment, you can tweet at Sex Talk Tuesday, at Shush for Women, or directly to me at Dr. Chantal. Just please make sure to use the hashtag Sex Talk Tuesday so I can follow your comments and raise them during our conversation. So let's get started. I first want to start talking about a little bit of history. Candida, I know this is a really broad question, but can you tell us just a little bit about your background?
All right. So anyway, basically I came of age around the so-called sexual revolution, and I studied in art college, and I was in entertainment, and then I left. I grew up in New York, in Manhattan, and then I left for California. Went to San Francisco in the 70s, and it was really quite a scene there, and I ended up getting involved with underground theater and things that, at that time in the 70s, we were all about not being materialistic, and we didn't do things for money, but we had to pay our rent. And so I went looking for extra money, and I answered an ad for nude modeling, which, having gone to art schools and drawing from nude models, it was not a big deal. Although I have to admit that I was very shy, and it was actually hard for me to take off my clothes and do those things in front of the camera, but the money was great, and I was a performer at heart. So I got into adult movies in front of the camera. Yeah. And I only did about maybe 25 movies in about 5 years, and which is nothing compared to what the girls do today. But anyway, I really became disenchanted with adult movies. I thought they really lacked any real sensuality or eroticism, and they lacked a woman's voice. And I decided it was time for me to get out and pursue other goals in my life. But I had a lot of conflict. So I went through this whole process of making sure I was comfortable with having been in movies. And I realized that I had to really decide for myself what I thought of adult movies and not what the culture told me. And it really, the irony is that what I thought was going to put closure to Candida Royalle actually ended up opening this whole other sort of Pandora's box for me, where I started thinking, gee, wouldn't it be interesting to do movies from a woman's point of view, in movies that women could relate to, that couples could watch together. And we're talking about I was in movies from about 1975 to 1980, and we're talking now maybe about 83, 84, and the idea of women watching porn was just not even heard of. There was a brief period in New York City in particular when it was sort of this hip thing to go to the movie theaters that played Devil and Miss Jones and Deep Throat. And, it was kind of this risque thing. But for the most part, people still didn't talk about porn. They didn't admit to watching it. And women certainly didn't admit to watching it. And I just thought, these movies maybe could serve a function. They maybe could help us get to know each other better, help understand what each of us wants, what women want. And I just started thinking about how interesting it would be to try to make movies that really spoke from a woman's point of view. And I felt like I had nothing to lose. I had a big scarlet letter on me already. And, also at that point, because it was sort of the perfect storm was created because right around that time, the home video was suddenly came about. Video was created and cable TV. And I realized that Candida Royalle wasn't going anywhere. All my movies were coming out again, re-released on video. And but they weren't movies that I could relate to. And so, but this was a scenario now where couples could watch in their own home and women could take a look at erotic movies in the privacy and the safety of their own home. They didn't have to go to these sleazy, dark theaters. And so, I was married at the time, and my ex-husband's father was in the film business, mainstream film business, but was also financing some of the bigger budget movies that like Chuck Vinson was doing, like Roommates and Games Women Play, some of the really big classics. And he heard about my idea and what I was talking about. At the time, I was working with a woman named Lauren Nemi, and we got this idea together to create movies that were mostly visuals and music, so we didn't have to depend on a lot of serious acting or anything. And he thought it was just a great idea and offered to put up the money. And that's really how it began. We were very fortunate. I came up with the concept. The timing was perfect. My family, my in-laws were willing to put up the money, and 1984 we came up with the name Fem Productions, and made 3 movies that first year, and the rest is history. I had a lot of naysayers. I had to go. My father-in-law said, "I'll only put up the money if you find distribution first." And most of the people in LA, I was in New York, most of the people in LA, where the companies were, told me kind of very patronizing, "Nice idea, Candida, but this is a boys' club. Women aren't interested." And I knew they were wrong. I had this gut feeling. I'd been in the feminist movement. I could tell that women were starting to really explore their sexuality. They were interested in watching erotic movies, but there was nothing out there for them. And I just knew the timing was right. There was an audience there. All you had to do was create the right kind of movie, and they would come, so to speak.
And they did, obviously. I mean,
yes,
it seemed like they really turned out. So it's interesting to listen to what you're talking about, because it sounds like, there's so much of social change in your story, but then there's also personal evolution. And that's really, really interesting to think about how you as an individual sort of, moved through this process. It's also interesting to think about how, for as radical of an idea of what you were talking about in the 70s, in the 80s, these themes are still very present today. We still hear that women don't watch porn. We still hear that, no couples want to look at adult content. And that seems to be exactly what you were, or one of the things you were kind of dealing with. Does that strike you at all as interesting, Candida, that the reactions and the responses to adult content are still kind of the same today? Or is that just a wider rhetoric that we get?
Oh, I think it's a bit of both. I think that we have a lot invested in this idea that women are innocent, that they're delicate, that they don't want hardcore pornography. And this is something of a sort of glue that holds the culture together. Women have always been assigned as the arbiters of morality. We can kind of look the other way as men go off and have their affairs or go off with prostitutes. But, culturally, traditionally, women wouldn't do such a thing. And, we can't have both people running around, or who's going to take care of the family. And so we have a lot invested in this notion. The double standard is still alive and well in our culture. On the other hand, it is still alive and well in this culture. And unfortunately, things have changed, but they're very, very slow to change. You're talking about cultural notions and ideas that have been around for a very, long time. And, this is not just 10, 20 years. We're talking century. I mean, and I think these things don't change easily or quickly. I think that many young women are much more comfortable watching porn. But I think that there are still a lot of women who are very uncomfortable with it. And so it's something that will take a while to change.
Well, I mean, it's interesting too that you point out context, because you're absolutely correct in terms of, 20 years, 30 years, however long, your career has been and had significant influence so far. We are talking about, gender constructions and dichotomies and ideas and these bizarre notions about who should be behaving in this way or that have been around essentially since the dawn of time. So
yeah,
it's interesting to think about somehow getting impatient about social change and realizing that we're talking about, changing glaciers basically here. So it really is incredible, the difference that has occurred when you think about it in the wider context. So, let's move a bit into wider context and talk about contemporary context and bring in, some insights from Jacky and thinking about, when we're talking about porn from a woman's perspective or feminist porn today. Candida, how do you think that that's changed? Is there a difference today than, in the 80s, let's just say? And then we'll hear from Jacky as well.
Well, I think there really has been a leap forward, I would say, in the last 10 years. It's like I said, it's been a slow movement. I was really surprised. It seemed to me that it took an entire generation before we saw young women really picking up the cameras and going about doing it themselves, creating their own vision. It's almost like my generation's daughters finally came around. And but it's also, I find it, something else that is happening is we're so eager now. It seems that whenever the culture sees something new happening, then they're all over it, and then it's taken and it's eaten up and pulled into the culture in a big way, and in a way it almost loses its intensity, its significance. But what I find a little frustrating is that now it's such a big media thing to talk about feminist porn, that it's almost like all you have to do is be a woman and pick up a camera and it's feminist porn. Like, I never really even called myself a feminist pornographer. I didn't like calling my work porn because porn encompasses so much now that I think has nothing to do with what I do, that, we need to come up with other terminology, more nuanced terms for this. But that said, I find that a lot of what's being made and labeled feminist porn is labeled so because women are doing it. And some of what I see is not very different than what the guys are doing. And I just wish that whoever is coming out and creating porn, creating erotica, would do something that is truly different, truly unique, and not just more cum shots, come in the face, the same old wham bam, thank you ma'am type stuff, but something truly different.
It's really interesting what you're talking about when you think about the idea of, just because a woman is doing it makes it feminist. That's an interesting thing to think about, because that implies that there's no intention behind anything. Just because I do something, is it feminist? Not necessarily. So there is kind of a play there. Then you would also, sort of couple that idea with the idea that a man can do something that's feminist. And it really is interesting when you think about the language and the vernacular, particularly as you think about how many people are speaking about porn today. Just recently, Shush's founder and leader, Angie Roundtree, who produces the show, she was actually speaking to the Sundance Institute about this very issue and related issues about what does porn for women mean? What does feminist porn mean? So it's really in, some of the most highly respected thought leader and thought leadership organizations in, our culture now. But at the same time, does that mean that the narrative is getting, a nuanced discussion? What do you think about all this, Jacky? What do you think about the idea of something being feminist just because a woman is doing it, or, the contemporary state of feminist porn or porn for women?
Well, I mean, I think I kind of hold a different perspective in that I feel that women, you can't box in a woman's fantasy and say it has to be a certain way, or it's not pro-woman, or it's not for women. And there are plenty of women that I know, and I was one of those women that liked more hardcore pornography. And although it's not really what I shoot, I certainly think a woman can take a feminist perspective to something much harder core. If you look at Dana Vespoli, I mean, that's a perfect example right there. But I mean, it's a sort of a fine line. I think today, the tube sites have kind of created this culture. And I mean, and Candida, you bring up a great point where it's like, everyone's just like, porn, and it's feminist porn, and it's so popular. But I think what's happening is that you're seeing a lot of content that's looking quote unquote male, but that's because a lot of us are having to cater to who's distributing our films, and a lot of us don't have full creative control, and a lot of those distributors are owned by men, and there's certain expectations. So I think until you're really your own producer, your own distributor, it's kind of hard, because right now it's all about return on investment and making a profit. And in order to do that, you also have to please other people, and they might not be fully in line with what your overall perspective is. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the challenge. Like, I mean, I've watched some of your stuff, and I'm like, wow. I mean, it's so amazing how porn back in the day, I mean, it was just, there was so much more focus on the actual porn experience, where it's just like, you see the two people actually having sex, and it's not all these close-ups. And I mean, you could set up a wider shot, and that's great. And it can be a shorter sex scene. And today it's like, there's all these parameters. It must be 20 minutes, and we must see X amount of penetration. And there's something that kind of takes away that creative control. And it's really about fighting the man now, it feels like.
Is it still that way? Because it always was that way. And you're right. I think that the fact that I did have my own investors helped. I still went to a traditional distributor and talked him into distributing my work, but it's always been that way otherwise. It was always, you have to do this, you have to do that. And, I have to apologize. I was sent one of your movies, and my DVD player is playing tricks with me, and I'm so frustrated because I come totally unprepared in terms of having watched it, but I'm going to go over to watch it with a friend at their place tonight, so I'm really sorry. I'm very embarrassed about that, but I know your work is very popular, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. But that's what was going on then, and it's almost, what's frustrating to me is I wish that I had the ability to, really, a woman needs to start a distribution company, because the market is there. And this old porn world that still has such a grip on everything is really, all they're doing is they're keeping it in a certain place. They're keeping it a fringe form of entertainment. I maintain that there is a huge audience out there waiting for something truly unique and artful and interesting. It's just that we are still controlled by dinosaurs, unfortunately, who think they know what people want. And yes, there is a huge market of people that do want what they're putting out there, but there's another segment, and that's who I'm trying to reach, or was trying to reach. And I know they're there and just waiting, hungry for something different and new, and really good.
I feel so like pumped up right now, and at the same time sort of depressed because
oh no, I don't mean
I'm
to
like,
say that.
we should start a distribution company.
But
I think that there's some really good stuff coming out, like Jacky's work and the women that you mentioned. I like some of the stuff coming out of Europe. Petra Joy's work is very interesting, and Erica Lust, and there's Anna Brownfield in Australia does really great work. It's there. It's just, it's hard for women to get the budgets that we need because of what's happening in the overall business. As long as viewers want free porn, we're not going to get to make good porn. And people have to realize that, like I live off of my royalties, and you don't want to pay for it, I can't make the movies. So the market itself is hurting, but I think there is a lot of talent out there, a lot of really good talent.
It's really interesting to think about all of these, behind the scenes structural, institutional, and mechanical issues that you both are describing. Jacky, you were big thumbs up for Erica Lust. Why? I mean, aside from being awesome.
I mean, Erica Lust is amazing, and I think that, it's different in Europe. I mean, I don't know a lot of the business structure in Europe, but there certainly isn't. It seems, at least from the production value, that there's more money going into what's being produced, but also stylistically, it seems more like just a standard European indie film versus what we would call pornography today. I mean, there's a fine line between what you call art and what you call porn, and one thing's okay and one thing's not. But Erica's really has that feel of being a genuine film.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about all of these different personalities and people and different global spaces that are producing this content. Now, it's funny because we could get kind of stuck on what's wrong, but there's also a lot of interesting things in terms of what's right. And I'm looking on Twitter right now because I like to look at Twitter while we're doing this. And Colleen's Dragon actually had a really interesting question / comment for both of you in terms of being inspirations. Because clearly, in spite of how the more things stay the same, obviously there's a lot of change. And Colleen wanted to know if either of you ever think about what you're doing I'm paraphrasing her question, but in terms of being inspirations, do you at either point in either of your careers or processes think about the fact that you are inspiring other women to work on breaking boundaries? Colleen, do you want to start, Candida?
Yeah, I definitely thought about that. I knew that I started this in 1984, and that was a long time ago, and I knew and hoped that I would inspire other women to get out there and have the courage to burst through and create their own vision. I've had some women direct for me, which was really, really fun and exciting. My good friends Annie Sprinkle, Veronica Hart, Gloria Leonard, Veronica Vera all directed for me. Then I did that one movie I got out under my Femme Chocolat label, where a lovely, very talented young African-American woman directed for me, Viola Abrams. She went by a different name in the movie, but it was, I have really, and then I've been distributing some of Petra Joy's work. I've really tried to help encourage other women. I'm very aware of having an influence and inspiring them. And that makes me feel really good.
Yeah. What about you, Jacky? Do you ever think about what is it like to be an inspiration?
I mean, I don't really think about it in terms of with regards to like other filmmakers, but for me, it's just like I really want to create content that reaches people and speaks to somebody, makes them think, makes them, challenges them to think about their own sexuality and their own sexual fantasies. So for me, it's about reaching my audience. Or reaching a audience, or just even reaching an individual person. And I don't necessarily go, oh, I hope I'm inspiring, but when I create something, I say, I hope this speaks to somebody and it means something to somebody, because it means something to me.
Is it ever?
I would agree with that, by the way. I definitely am thinking more about my viewers and the impact my work is having on them and what it's saying to them. I would agree with Jacky there.
Does it ever feel pressure laden? Like, do either of you ever feel the pressure of, being very prominent and really breaking boundaries and what that might mean?
No, I don't. Do you, Jacky?
I mean, I feel pressure with certain things. Like I feel pressure when the most pressure I've ever felt was working on a sequel for a movie, because if you start with one that's highly successful, there's always that, oh God, I don't want the next one to fail, because then what does that say? So for me, it's always trying to do something better than the last thing I did. And that just comes from the fact that I'm a type A personality and I have a very overbearing parents that are always like, strive to be the best always. So, I mean, I think from that standpoint, there's a fair amount of pressure that I feel with what I do, but that's all self put on me. So.
And, actually, I will jump in here, Chantel. I would change my answer. I think that I have felt, I think things have become so much looser now in terms of what you can talk about and put on film. But I remember that we had a lot of very long and intense discussions in the 90s about what kind of fantasies you could portray on film that were that you were crossing a line, you were sending the wrong kind of message to women. And to men. The most obvious one being the proverbial rape fantasy. And, it's known that is one of the most popular fantasies for women. And if you analyze it, it's really, I think it's really because women are still so burdened by this double standard and so afraid of coming off as, a woman that's too sexual, that knows too much. And so that she needs to find some kind of permission, some way of letting go enough to really allow herself to be pleasured and have an orgasm. And so sometimes that involves having fantasizing that you cannot, you're with someone who won't take no for an answer. You're being forced. You're being raped. It does not mean that you really want to go out and be raped in a dark alley somewhere. The whole point of fantasy is that you are in control. And so the discussion would come up, I'm here I want to turn on my viewer. And so if that's one of the hottest fantasies for them, how do I show this rape fantasy and without sending the wrong message to people and letting people think that she really wants to be raped? And of course, there's always the thought, you can show them having the discussion and she says, it's okay, you can rape me. Well, that's sort of that kind of takes the heat away, doesn't it? So it's a very complicated, it could be very complicated, and it's something that I dealt with for some time.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the 90s, because that's a discussion that happens currently. That is something that
we're forever reinventing the wheel.
Forever, and never dealing with the parts of the wheel that maybe need to be dealt with, or just having the same discussion over and over again. What do you think about that, Jacky? I feel like I cut you off.
I absolutely you just spoke right to my heart, Candida, because it's so true. And I do a lot of faux cest now, and it's the same thing. A lot of people have that fantasy about incest, but it's not like they really want to have sex with a family member, but it's something that they want to fantasize about. But then we run into the legalities of, you have to say step, you have to, say that it's consenting before it happens. And it's sort of, it loses that luster, because you think, okay, well, now I'm just watching porn that's following rules. And it's sort of, it's unfortunate that we don't have those freedoms and that we're all still fighting to get closer to them, but not quite there yet.
And sometimes it's the women and the feminists who are criticizing us. Like I remember when I've also played with mild SM, surrender, domination. It's a very hot thing to be able to totally surrender to someone and give up your control, give up power. And men enjoy doing it just as much as women, giving up their power and their control. But I remember when I released Stud Hunters, and there was a scene there between a woman who kind of she just comes in like a bulldozer and takes charge, and I didn't even know she was going to be so intense about it. And I had this, I won't say who it was, but a very still popular group of women that have their own store and now make their own movies and release movies. You probably can figure out who it is, but and they would not carry it because they felt that I didn't show that people were using the right. They were making up and agreeing on the right. What is it called? The call word or the safe word. I didn't show them negotiating the safe word and all that stuff. And it's like, oh gosh, and also they felt like the woman was kind of heavy set, and so she chose, and I let my actresses and actors have a say in how they show themselves, portray themselves. She chose to leave certain items of her clothing on. She felt obviously more comfortable. I was criticized for that, for objectifying a woman who had weight on her and, making her keep her clothes on because she was less attractive when I had nothing to do with it. I was letting her choose for herself. So I tell you, women and feminist women can be some of the harshest and most unfair critics.
I agree. I absolutely agree, which is so unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, the greatest critics in the business have been other women, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I understand it because, we women have been through a lot. We're trying to change things. But, way back when Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin were still running the anti-porn show, the late Andrea Dworkin, they stated that there can be no such thing as porn or erotica that really was egalitarian, and that to show any kind of show a woman giving up her power, surrendering, was demeaning, and we should never show that because we have to show women always being in control and in power. And what a real dominatrix will tell you, and what I learned playing a little bit with that world, was that when you are able to surrender and give up certain kinds of control, it actually empowers you.
For sure.
It's a funny contradiction, or I can't think of the right word, but it's the opposite, actually.
Right. It's really interesting to think about this because I think the three of us in our own ways are all very, very like-minded about this. But it is absolutely fascinating how we continually have to explain the differences between production and reception. The woman you're describing in your film, Candida, had chosen to present herself in a particular way, but that wasn't even part of the conversation when the reception of your project, what was in question. So, I speak to media about this quite a bit, about what we see on screen, as with any other film, is not necessarily what's happening behind the scenes, because we're talking about a film project. And that's a really interesting thing that, for whatever reason, we still can't wrap our heads around it when it has to do with porn. The other thing that's interesting about this too is the idea of what is supposed to be happening. Your sex is supposed to look like this. This is what's desirable. And that rhetoric is present in every corner almost of our culture, it seems, be it very conservative or feminist or, spiritual or whatever it is. people seem to have ideas about what sex is supposed to look like, which is fine as long as people understand that there are many, many, many endless looks at what sex can be, and, allowing for people to express themselves. And, we still struggle with those two issues in our culture. And it's fascinating to hear from you both about how, these issues have been present and continue to be present. So let's talk about like the present and the future for porn from a woman's perspective, feminist porn, just porn production in general. What do the two of you think? This is a hard question, and I'm totally just jumping on you with it. But where do you see porn going in the next few years, in the next few decades? Like, what are we going to see, or what would you like us to see? I know this is the world's most difficult question. Well,
it really is. I've been asked this for years now, and I never really have a very good answer. I know what I'd like to see. I'd like to see people continue to have the freedom to explore and, create their own vision, present their own vision. I'd like to see many, many more women get involved in production. And I'd like to see the stigma removed from porn. That's going to be a tough one because, like I said earlier, there's so much that falls under the category of pornography that is absolutely disturbing, even to me, that as long as we call it porn, we tend to stigmatize and ourselves and our work to begin with. We push it into the fringe, and like I said, I almost feel like we have to come up with new terminology just to begin with, to set ourselves and our work apart.
Right, to distinguish like a more erotica piece versus something else, perhaps. What do you think, Jacky? What do you want to see happening?
Well, I think, I mentioned this before, but I think the tube sites, have really shifted the way that the industry has to look at the industry now, and they're slowly killing a lot of companies that were once thriving. But as a result, it's actually, dare I say, in some ways, helping the cream rise to the top. And what I mean when I say that is that when you're producing content that's worth writing, because that's really what the goal and objective is now, is creating content that people actually want to pay for. Because on the tube sites, it's so saturated with just absolutely everything stolen. But when you have, more scripted content and features or higher quality things people actually want to own and pay for, that's the point to keep companies alive, unless they're doing business with the tube sites, in which case, they're set for life. But I think that's kind of where the other companies are kind of having to shift and go towards, and it's where my company, New Sensations, has kind of gone toward, is the higher quality scripted type of content that people do pay for. And we still do have DVD sales that are doing great, and our internet presence is also doing well. So
yeah, it's interesting to think about, today in 2015, the very real conversation we need to have about, be it the sloppiest porn or the most artistic erotica and everything in between, but how we really need to sort of take a look at ourselves as a culture and think about adult content as a good that's worth paying for. And that's something that we've really gotten away from as a collective culture. And, that's a bit of a struggle. So it's interesting. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here too, as we're kind of, I'm one eye on the clock, which is terrible to have to say. But, there's so much that, you've done, Candida, in terms of changing the world and how we think about erotica, but that's not everything that you do. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the other projects that you're working on currently? I know that you're working on a documentary project. I know that you mentioned that you're thinking about an autobiographical project. What do you have in the works? Like, what can we see from you?
Well, one thing that was that came after my film production company was my Natural Contours line, which we were actually, much like Femme, being the first to create movies that women could enjoy and not feel embarrassed to watch. I was approached by a Dutch industrial designer to create vibrators and intimate massagers and products that women would feel the same way about. So that in the mid-90s, we went to work. We created the Natural Contours line that were far more artistic type of product, and we really helped make these a mainstream item that women could shop in safe, pleasant places for. So I'm very proud of that. We have a few new products coming out soon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry. And the other, you mentioned my documentary. It is an autobiographical documentary. The working title is While You Were Gone, The Untold Story of Candida Royalle. If you go to my website, it will take you to that website. My website is just candidaroyalle.com, 2 L's and an E. And it's basically about the search for my mother who left when I was 18 months old. I wanted to find her or find out the truth. And, it's come at a time in my life where many people know that I'm dealing with a major health issue. And, things happen when you are faced with your own mortality and you realize that there are things that you really want to do and answers you want to seek out that before you don't have the chance to do it any longer. So this is something that's very close to my heart, and I'm presently working on and raising money for. That's
very intense. How has that affected you in going in on that search? And, it sounds like such a personal project. Is there anything that you can compare with, early 80s burying your body on the screen to contemporary, really burying your soul?
Well, that's a really good analogy, Chantel. I never really thought of it. You're right. I guess I've there's something about me that I've always had the ability and the need to bear something. I was always, as a kid, I was a performer. I sang in jazz clubs. I was a dancer. I've always had a need to express myself. Going into porn was certainly way out of left field, but it was about expressing myself. I exposed myself in a way that most women wouldn't think of doing. And yes, I guess it's an extension of that. This is really the inner me that's coming out. Many people have heard about my Club 90 project, which was, we created the first adult film support group ever. That's with the same women that directed for me. Annie Sprinkle, Gloria Leonard, Veronica Vera, Veronica Hart, Kelly Nichols and Sue Nero were originally in it for about a year, and they left. But the 5 of us continued to meet, and we did a performance. Well, 7 of us did a performance in New York called Deep Inside Porn Stars, and it was a spoof on or a takeoff on the Deep Inside movies about porn stars, but this was bearing our souls, what brought us to this career and how it's affected us. And this is kind of an extension. I guess my documentary is really bearing my soul, telling the story that I've been waiting to tell from my own words. It's something I've been in countless interviews, and I've never talked about certain things in my life. Right. I'm finally going to do it, possibly in a book as well. I did one book already, How to Tell a Naked Man What to Do, a really fun how-to book, to help women get comfortable with their sexuality. But the book I want to tell now is really about my life and, dealing with having been abandoned by my mother at a very young age, my sister as well, and how that's affected me, and what led me to go into porn, and all kinds of I'm ready to tell all, let's just say.
Well, it's interesting, one, it's going to be so interesting and so deep I can't wait to see it. But really, it's interesting to think about. I always have to be Miss Sociology here. It's interesting to think about you as a leader. Really kind of setting the tone and leading the charge. And oftentimes, when somebody is a leader, nobody ever goes, "Hey, leader, like, what's going on with you?" And that's interesting because you really presented all these opportunities just in listening to your discussion, to ask other women performers and directors, what's going on? How are you? Let's talk about a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. And, it is interesting that at this point you, Candida, are finally going to have that opportunity. Jacky, do you feel that you never get to talk about your story? I mean, is it something that happens to you too? And I'm curious because I'm sure there are many women out there watching right now, aspiring directors, other directors in the business that would want to ask Candida a director question. So, one, do you ever feel like you don't get to tell your story? And two, do you want to ask Candida a director question?
Okay, well, the first, with regards to the first question, I'm somebody who's more of a question asker anyway than somebody who likes to talk about myself, and I'm not too terribly worried at this point of telling my story or having people question or be curious about it, because I'd rather know everyone else's stories, to be quite frank. And yes, Candida, I have a question for you. I have so many, but I'm trying to think of what's the best one. I mean, what would you say, because I know as a woman in this business, I still face quite a few challenges just because of my sex. And I'm curious, what was the greatest hurdle that you faced as a woman from a man back when you first started producing your own content? And how did you deal with it?
The funny thing is everyone assumes that men really tried to push back. Mm-hmm. And, the truth is money talks. And as soon as they saw how well my stuff was selling when it first came out with hardly any marketing, they respected me. I really didn't have a lot of pushback. I would say the worst critics who were just taunting me was this sort of gang of outlaws, out in California back then, the Bill Margold and all of these guys out there that kind of resented me as this little upstart, who decided to take porn and make it something that nice girls would watch, that housewives would watch. They resented it, and they wanted to keep it this sort of renegade world. They didn't want women entering it, and they were very critical of my work. They called it the porn version of Muzak, and finally, I had, it was at one of the VSDA show that we all used to go to in Vegas. And I ended up having this big row, this big to-do, this showdown with Bill, I think it was Bill Margold, and just, and then this other woman who was my saleswoman jumped in and she took over for a while. And it ended with, I have photographs of him kneeling at my feet, kissing my hand, because he gained this whole new respect for me that I took him on and held my own. And, we've been friends ever since. But really, I've really not had a lot of pushback from the industry. They respected what I did. One of the big fathers of porn, I don't want to mention his name. He was the big distributor for a long time, and he distributed my very early work before I started my own distribution company. Now Adam and Eve distributes it. But he would always like, you don't know what you're talking about. There's no such thing as a women's market. And then finally, a few years later, I walked into his booth at one of the Vegas shows, and he said, Candida, I have to admit, you were right all along. You were right on target. You had the vision, and I congratulate you. So I've been treated pretty well, actually, by the industry. No big pushbacks.
Can I ask one more question, Chantel? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever faced a dilemma, like an ethical dilemma, as a director, Candida? I'm curious. And how did you deal with it, and what was the situation?
Jacky, can you elaborate for people out there who maybe are going, what might an ethical dilemma be? Could you maybe think about a hypothetical ethical dilemma?
Okay, like a hypothetical ethical dilemma would be a performer tells you that they're uncomfortable, and then you say, okay, do you want to stop? And they say, no, let's keep going, but you can tell they're in pain. But, they've told you they're fine and want to keep going. I mean, that's just a hypothetical. Right. I'm not saying that that's your example.
Interesting. I was going to bring up something about, realizing that one of my performers was struggling with drug use. And the question always comes up, well, do you hire? Well, I have a rule for myself. If I feel and I sense that someone, particularly a female, is looking to be in the movies for self-destructive reasons, to act out feelings of poor self-esteem, I will not hire her. And that, it's tricky for me because I feel like I'm one of the good people to work with, but I don't want to be an enabler for someone to act out in a way that is really self-destructive. I had a situation where a young woman, just so talented, so wonderful, and she kept wanting her husband to come on the set, but I, in the one way, we all went away for the production, and on the one hand, I knew that she would be happier and more comfortable with him there. On the other hand, I suspected that he would bring drugs. And so I had to not allow it. We just refused. We do not never allowed any drugs on the set. And people have to sign forms and everything for me. But the question you asked is also a very good one. And I did have something like that happen where my lead actress had this sounds so silly and so provincial, but I'm not completely comfortable with portraying anal sex in my movies because I know that a lot of women still find it uncomfortable. And I'll never forget one of the early distributors saying something to me like, when I first started out, and I used to never tell the story but anyway, he said, Candida. That's how we talk, Candida.
Sorry.
For a while, the big thing that men could never get their wives to do was blowjob. And now everyone does blowjobs, so it's no big deal. So he said, what you need to portray things that are still taboo, and that the husbands want to try to get the women to do like anal sex. And I remember walking out of there thinking, does he realize who I am and what I do? How can he say that to me? It was like totally backing up what women, anti-porn people say the business is about. Right. Now, no one's ever said that thing to me since, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that still goes on, but I have a little problem with anal sex, and I wanted to show it. I know that it can be very hot and enjoyable, and so I used I used an actual married couple, and she agreed that they would do an anal scene for me, and I realized that she was going through a lot of anxiety about it and worried that something was going to happen, and I asked her if she wanted to not do it, and she said, no, I'm fine. And so we did do it, but I did kind of cut it short, and you don't really see much of it. I feel like you can make things look like anal sex. I've had people say, oh, we saw an anal scene in your movie, and it wasn't, but it looked like it. So I'll kind of simulate it, but it's just such a personal thing. I don't know. But that was an awkward situation for me. And because she said that she was all right with it, I went on with it. But it was a difficult call.
It's really interesting to think about the negotiation of ethics and what's happening on set and what does it mean and how do you make those decisions either in real time or in your overall production. And it just gets back to what we kind of has been sort of a theme throughout our conversation, that what works for some doesn't necessarily work for others. And as long as there is consent and as long as the vision is respectful and the content is there for the greater good, not for the greater gross, I guess.
Right.
Better way to say it. Then what you end up with is a diverse array of content that gets at different looks and different acts and different themes, but still has this humanity to it. And that's really where you get the best porn, for lack of a better way of saying it. So,
I have kind of a rule of thumb that as long as the woman appears to be enjoying herself and seems to really be into it, I can enjoy what I'm watching. I can enjoy what I'm seeing. I'm very perceptive, and I can tell when the actress really is having issues with what she's doing, and then it's no longer enjoyable for me, and I won't watch it.
That's really interesting. So, we're getting at ethics here, and I just got pinged with another question. So, this is sort of a controversial one, but let's go for it since we're having this conversation. The idea of ethical porn is something, we were talking about feminist porn. I had romance porn down as another like buzz phrase and stuff. And those things have significant meaning, but then, sometimes they get co-opted and picked up. And I wonder what you both think about the phrase ethical porn. I know you, Jacky, for many years now, and Candida, I have immense respect for your work and listening to you speak. I'm going to guess that both of you are and will continue to be and have been ethical producers and directors. But what about content that overtly describes itself as ethical, thus saying that other content isn't? How do you feel about that ethical porn thing nowadays? It's a can of worms, I know. It's interesting. I mean, you both think you're ethical, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's like they say one person's porn is another person's erotic, or one person's erotic is another. Someone who may look at my work and think it's completely unethical just because I show people really having sex. Right. So it becomes a very personal issue or a personal judgment call. But I think that we all have a responsibility. I've always felt this way with any medium I've worked in, whether it's writing or filmmaking. We all have a responsibility to with what we're putting out there. And I need to be able to stand behind what I do, what I say, what I portray, and be able to look at myself in the mirror at night before I go to bed and believe that, I've challenged myself a lot over the years to be able to do what I do. And that's important because you will get challenged when you go out and do interviews. And, but I think we all have to stand up and take a hard look at what we do and really think about it and be able to stand behind what we do. It's up to each of us. And, there's not, you don't want to get to where someone's telling you what you can do and what you can't do, because then we really run into freedom of expression issues, democracy. And so I get very upset when I see certain kinds of stuff going on, like that documentary that's been playing around lately, Hot Young Girls Wanted or something. I just, I know a lot of people are saying, yay, these girls wouldn't let themselves be victims. But what I also saw were girls going to sets and not realizing what they were being sent to and being put through some really horrible stuff. And that upsets me because that's going to make other people come and try to control the industry and what we do. If we continue to do things that really are ethically questionable, it's going to bring the wrath down on the entire industry. And a lot of young people, there's a very short memory, and they don't realize that in the early 90s, the industry was really assaulted badly. Mm-hmm. We couldn't show a lot of perfectly normal things because they were being misconstrued, and they had, people like Rob Black, shoving girls' faces in the toilet and getting spit on, and at least he's the one that ended up in jail, but they caused a lot of problems for the industry.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about, this whole ethics issue again. Jacky, do you have any thoughts on the idea of ethical porn?
I mean, for me, I think, I agree with you. I'm not a fan of any sort of porn that depicts violence or this face fucking stuff. I understand that it's a fantasy, and if people are consenting to it, then it is what it is. But for me, I live and die by ethics. I live and die by it on set, before the production even happens, in how I treat the performers, in making sure that everyone's aware of what's happening before I even book them, making sure they know who they're working with, so nobody shows up with any surprises, or if anything changes, always communicating limits. But I do a lot of content that people would consider unethical. I mean, I do a lot of faux scenarios. But for me, I think where the ethical line is drawn is that I'm creating a fantasy that is something that happens within one's mind. It's not necessarily a physical manifestation of like violence or anything. It's simply a fantasy, and I'm bringing that to life. Do I feel that the content I'm doing is unethical and that it's going to somehow promote incest among people? No, because at the end of the day, I know that what I am creating is a fantasy. But what you said, Candida, is completely true. I think that when you see documentaries like this one that came out, there is a perception of the industry as being somehow unethical. But I do also feel on the flip side that it is people's responsibility to ask questions. And if they are a legal adult, they should know that they have the ability to say, who am I working with? And not all directors do that, unfortunately. Not all directors hold themselves to the same, criteria that I do when I book people. But then the performers kind of need to take it upon themselves to find out and answer these questions, because not everybody in this industry is ethical, unfortunately.
Right.
And this is just another question that gets at another thing I find myself saying very, very often, is that the adult entertainment industry is not an anomaly. It's a microcosm. There are unethical people everywhere, and there are ethical people everywhere. And it is an interesting sea that we are in currently, negotiating, notions of erotica, sex work, entertainment, porn, how it intersects with wider society. This has been an amazing conversation. I want to ask both of you if you have, just a brief, wider takeaway point for our listeners / viewers before we close it out. Jacky, what would you like to leave people with?
I think that you kind of said it best, Chantal, which is that, there's good and bad people everywhere. There's good and there's bad porn. And I think, there's so many people in the industry really trying to create great content. And I guess I'll end on this note, which I always end on. Please pay for your porn. Please, please pay for it. We're not working for free.
Exactly.
Candida, what would you like to leave our listeners and viewers with?
Well, I think also related to what we've been talking about is that the more legitimate the whole concept of explicit adult entertainment becomes, the better the situation will be for performers. And the more we insist on keeping it a fringe thing that isn't respected, then you can't. We need to legitimize the industry. We need to have organizations set up to help the performers, so that they have a place to go. They know they have someone to talk to, about who they can trust, who they can work for, who they shouldn't work for. We need to get porn or adult explicit entertainment out of the gutter, out of the extreme fringes, and make it just another form of art entertainment so that it can be the kind of place that people want to work and will have good working conditions, and we will attract good people into it who have ethics and who have talent, and we'll end up with good product that way too. So support it.
So support it.
Pay for it.
Pay for your porn, people. You heard it here, everybody, from two amazing women, two leaders in the adult business, and two real thought producers in our culture, Jacky St. James and Candida Royalle. Thank you so much for joining us today. For viewers out there who are wanting to get a hold of Jacky and or Candida, their Twitter handles are right below their smiling faces. CandidaRoyalle.com is also there for your looking. And in terms of performers looking for community or ideas about what is normal, acceptable, or just looking for a network, performers can go to APAC, which on Twitter is at APAC Social. It's the Adult Performer Advocacy Committee. It is run by performers, for performers, and for performers only. So it's an interesting space to check out. We are over time. Candida, thank you so much for being here. Jacky, thank you so much for being here. And thank you, MindBROWSE. MindBROWSE shows are brought to you live streaming and archived free of charge. Compliments of shush.com, the web's premier porn site for women and couples. You can visit them on Twitter at Shush for Women. This has been another fantastic Sex Talk Tuesday event. I'm Dr. Chantal Tibbles. I'll see y'all next time.